Welcome to Welcome Change, everyone. We will wait a few seconds for the Zoom room to fill up and then we'll get right to it. In the meanwhile, if you're wondering who's walking in the virtual door at the moment, we have quite a few people from mostly Middle East and Europe. But I stalked the participant list, so we also have participants from Southeast Asia and Latin America. So it's quite a diverse bunch. And we are thrilled to have so many of you from Ashoka's global community, as well as Tarek's and Helem's community. So welcome everyone. This is Ashoka's weekly news hour, where we hear from social entrepreneurs from around the world and their teams on timely pressing issues and solutions and insights they are getting from their work. My name is Zeynep Meydanoğlu. I'm based out of Istanbul, Turkey. I co-lead Ashoka's work here, and I'm also leading Next Now gender fields work globally. So for the next 30 minutes, one of the best parts of my job is I will be hosting and interviewing Tarek Zeidan about the LGBTQ movement, both in his locality, Lebanon, and also it will inevitably become global, I think, also internationally. So before we get started, let me share a few housekeeping rules about the Zoom room we are all sharing right now. First of all, we would love to hear from you. So although we can't see or hear you, we can hear your voice from the chat. And the second part of the conversation, we would like to spare for questions from you. So feel free to use the chat box and let us know any points, any questions, any issues you want us to address, and we'll do that in the second half of the conversation. Second, if there's anyone who wants to use captioning, it is available. So if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen to the three dots and select more, you should be able to turn on the captioning and also enjoy the conversation in written form. Okay, so without further ado, I would love to introduce Tarek and Helem to you today. So I think they are like a one-stop shop actually for the queer community in Lebanon, as well as anyone and everyone who wants to lift queer voices and lives. So they offer space for both the community and for any coalitions to take place. And I grew up in the 80s in Turkey, and there was a popular TV show called MacGyver. This was a guy who, I don't know if Tarek knows it, Gen Y people probably know it. So this was a guy who would ironically get locked up in closets all the time. And he would need to figure out a way of getting out of there. And he would make his own tools if he couldn't find anything. So I think it's also a bit like MacGyver. So they run a hotline, they do legal mitigation, they overcome barriers in access to education and employment. They also seek to provide protection services for violence, both domestic and in systemic forms. So they are a highly inventive, highly productive organization. So Tarek, welcome.
Thank you.
And I want to actually start with my first question. So last year was a year where everyone thought they had a tough time, but your city Beirut, with the Beirut blast of August, perhaps had one of the hardest times. And I wanted to ask about your community center there. I know it's up and running now, and it's an open space for anyone and everyone. So can you tell us a bit about how that works and how you stay focused when you're open to anyone and everyone?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining. Indeed, 2020 was an incredibly difficult year for most people around the globe, but especially for us in Lebanon and Beirut. Not only were we dealing with the pandemic, but we were dealing with a economic and political crisis that's still continuing to deepen even now. And unfortunately, 8 months ago, the city experienced a very horrific blast, which was around 600 meters away from the Halem Community and Services Centers. So we were forced to close for a long time in order to heal both as a community and as an institution. And I'm very happy to say that as of 2 weeks ago, we've reopened with 30% capacity, and we're back in full swing. It's very interesting that you start with the community center, because this is basically the central sort of force behind our theory of change. Because community work is messy, but our motto is say yes to the mess, because it's not just about building power as individuals, it's also building power as communities. And one of the most sort of the central tenet that we operate on is that we are not an institution that solves problems for queer people. We're an institution in which queer people solve problems, period. And therefore, what we do is that we give the work back as much as possible. And our community center and the public space, the non-commercial public space that we've created for queer people is necessary in order to do that. Because purposefully, there are no non-commercial queer spaces for queer people around the Arab world in general, and particularly in Lebanon. So meeting to mobilize and to think and to build power is very difficult without these public spaces being invested in and encouraged. And so it's not as much of a safe space as it is a brave space, in the sense that people that join it don't necessarily just come for them to secede from the outside world. It can be that, but it's more geared towards how do you re-energize and re-engage, and according to what plan and how, with everybody else involved.
I love that, the safe space versus the brave space kind of, and people being able to do both in one place. Can you tell us a bit, what are the rules and values you run it by? Because it's very open door. So what keeps it together?
Well, in the same spirit, there are no rules. There's rights and responsibilities, and you can't have the first without engaging in the second. Yeah. The idea of the space, obviously, people there's no tolerance policies when it comes to harassment, when it comes to any form of othering and all of that. But really, the community guidelines is how do you exist in a public space together, because it's a discipline. And the only way to learn a discipline is to do it and then learn it, rather than someone lecturing you what it is and come and see it. So the idea, all of our community guidelines are geared towards maintaining this holding environment that can withstand diversity and intersectionality. These are words that are thrown around a lot, but they're actually a massive responsibility, and they translate on the ground in incredibly complex and often and ways that are often at odds with what you're trying to do. So when you bring in diversity, you're bringing in a whole host of experiences, a whole host of values that need a place that can hold that while they calibrate. And they can only calibrate through confrontation and through discussion and debate. And that's exactly what we do. So every single time, every single meeting that we have, it's a constant reminder of, you don't represent anybody here but yourself. So don't come here representing a faction necessarily. Step up or step back, hear people first before you make an intervention. And the emphasis is always much more on listening than it is on speaking necessarily, because that's the natural impetus for people to do anyway. So
Yeah.
it's a complex place. It's not always pleasant, and it's not always calm, but that's kind of the point.
I think this is actually diversity and intersectionality kind of being thrown around a lot, but coming alive in every single meeting you have, every single interaction there is. I find that very inspiring, actually, and maybe thinking that's all we can do, actually, one step at a time to reach these big ideals. Can we, so I'm a bit obsessed with the community center. So I wanted to ask you, can you tell us a bit about some of the, let's say, projects or initiatives that stemmed from the community center work?
So we're, obviously as an institution, we have our ear very close to the ground, because the community is constantly in touch with us as activists and as people running an institution. And currently, the three major issues that we're concentrating on are labor, housing, and healthcare. And we're doing them and we're concentrating on them from a sort of a multi-sectoral approach that looks at the problem as a systemic problem rather than just one project or one campaign or whatever. If I'm going to give you an example, our labor rights work. So considering that we're an LGBT rights movement that has begun in the Arab world and that has for 20 years experimented with whether considering the movement from the global north or the west as a blueprint for our work, or whether to reject it entirely, or to figure out the Venn diagram that includes what we've learned from other movements that came before and what is quintessentially endemic to the region and to Lebanon. And sort of the central question that we ask ourselves now isn't how can we fix institutions to become LGBT inclusive? The central question has become, how do you improve the lives of LGBTQ people? And that question opens up a whole host of strategic, tactical, and sort of opportunities for you and widens the playing field. Because we've been obsessed for the past 20 years with legislative change, public engagement, policy change, institutional accountability, and that's really only one side, and the other side really needs to be explored further. So, so we don't just work on labor law reform, and we've completely changed the way we work on labor law reform. We work on employment and private sector engagement, capacity building of individuals, of potential employees, and community building simultaneously. Because when you map the system, you have to understand that all of these different factions are sort of both purposefully and sometimes without them knowing, contributing to the problem of homophobia in the workplace and transphobia in the workspace. So
let's actually talk a little bit about that. So you are engaging with employers a lot. And what's happening like on the individual level? You walk in and then what?
Well, first of all, it's not about me walking in, it's about us walking in.
Yeah.
And who exactly is us? So, for example, to give you a small idea, when it comes to engaging with potential employers, one of the most amazing sort of symbiotic relationships that we've had was with the disability rights movement, because people with physical disabilities and trans individuals both fundamentally are forced to live and operate in a world that wasn't built for them. And it wasn't built for them from a point of view of infrastructure, from a point of view of policy, from a point of view of a workplace culture, you name it. And so understanding what needs to happen and what exactly do we need to understand about employment spaces for us to even approach them became incredibly clear. Now, this is a tactic that is fundamentally different from the naming and shaming that you do when you're trying to pressure legislative institutions or the judiciary or the media or whatever. And that flexibility in being able to address these different problems, not depending on necessarily how you feel, but depending on what constitutes a solution at this particular juncture of the problem. So the flexibility of being able to alternate the carrot and the stick, turn up the heat, turn down the tension, whatever it is, has been incredibly important in us figuring it out. And the power that has allowed us to engage with multiple different groups was precisely that we didn't approach them just as the LGBTQ movement. And the real...
amazing. So you approach them as, for example, groups where employment was not designed or built for that group. So you're broadening your base, kind of moving your focus a level up, and also addressing kind of a problem of, people always hiring people like themselves, kind of this tendency. So you could also build alliances with the women's movement, for example, where men being hired for higher level positions. So it's just frees you up so much and opens up so much possibility, actually, when you refocus your lens the way you do.
The really interesting part, Zainab, is that thankfully the data and the science and the logic is on our side. When you talk to employers and you talk to them about benchmarks and profit margins and all of that, there's enough studies out there that show diversity is actually a positive, particularly once you've reached a particular critical mass in which employers, private sector, people concerned about their livelihoods, their businesses, whatever, need not worry about that in
Mhm.
terms, if you're just talking about the raw data. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, it's not just about the raw data. There's a
Mhm.
whole other hidden
Yeah,
aspect of the engagement that needs to
exactly. The
be focused on,
fear,
and that's
right?
what we do.
What are you finding out about the fear from the employer side? Like, because you have long conversations with them, any surprises there about homophobia that you're discovering?
Well, the surprises are always, it's because it's the least thing that you expect. And the way we engage with employers is the same way we engage with other potential allies, whether we're building community or whether we're trying to, integrate ourselves into an existing bigger sort of labor rights movement in general, is actually a very paradoxical realization, is that we as queer people, number one, represent loss to whoever is currently opposing our integration or engaged in homophobic or transphobic behavior. It's a very difficult thing to realize that you, even though you feel you're right, even though justice is on your side, you need to understand that you represent a certain kind of loss to the person that's resisting you. Whether it's a parent that's resisting the fact that she will never see her gay son get married, she might never see grandchildren. You need to understand that loss before you engage. And if you don't, and if you go in not understanding what loss you represent to the other person, that engagement won't be successful, because people don't resist change, they resist loss. So that has been one of the fundamental sort of breakthrough realizations that we've had, that has been ubiquitous across our entire engagement process, no matter who we're engaging with. That's
It's
number one.
deep at the same time. So I must say, I'm a fan of how you're broadening your base, kind
Yeah.
of this kind of refocusing on who else shares the same problem, and also how deep your understanding on the individual level is when you're building your allies. And another point of admiration is your allies, actually, your unlikely allies. So I
Yeah.
know you work with priests, I know you work with sheiks, I
Yeah.
know you work with the scouts instead of the school sometimes. So, yeah, please tell us a bit about that. How do these unlikely allies come about?
They do, because here's the thing. Um, there's no such thing as a broken system. The system is set up precisely to deliver the results it's delivering, and to be advantageous to certain people over others. That inexorably means that any intervention to shift that system needs to happen from the people at the receiving end of power, which is us. It is at the surface incredibly unfair. It's a brutal realization that you, who have been oppressed, need to not just lead yourself and your community, but also lead other factions, including the oppressor, out of the swamp of oppression, of homophobia or transphobia, which is the system that needs to move. And it's through this kind of engagement, it's through the last thing that any of these other factions expect is for you to come up to them and for you to approach them in that particular way, rather than to engage with them through social media or through some sort of interlocutor in which, where you're actively denying the confrontation to happen. So conflict and confrontation are completely different. It's easy to go to war. It's the easiest thing to go to war. It's one of the hardest things to sit in the same room and confront one another. And it's much more difficult for you to be denied in your humanity and in your capacity and in your opportunity and in your promise once you are in the room. And that's how we've been able to diagnose and identify allies in the most unlikely places. We're talking about rural communities, refugee communities, people in the religious establishment, people inside government who were never approached. And they certainly will never approach you because there's no impetus for them to do so. The system already advantages them. So that's how we've been able to sort of identify, by going in and really leveraging our curiosity. That's really has been
I think
the
that's
thing that works.
kind of one side of it, like, making someone step down from their privilege and kind of take action. The other side is, for example, street level activism is not for everyone. So you're not likely to see a priest on the street
No.
protesting with you, maybe. So how do we diversify kind of the way? So how can a priest support you, for example? How can they show their agreement and support in a way that fits their, let's say, job description?
That's a question you ask them, because expecting people to conform to what your idea is of engagement and support, you're setting yourself up to failure. And it's a strategic non-starter, because
Mhm.
protesting on the street is only one side of the coin. There are multiple other interventions that you can do: public, private, together, individual, that all contribute into shifting the system. And you have to have a long vision and really have mapped out the system, not just in terms of actors and institutions, but in terms of power. And
Mhm.
power doesn't just come in the form of things that we're used to, which is, government or the private sector institutions. It can be found anywhere: informal institutions, collectives, individuals on the ground, people that are able to move the playing field. And
Mhm.
the idea is to also make sure that your intervention is about solving the public problem. It's not about exonerating your personal outrage.
Mhm.
As paradoxical and as painful as that is, because queer people, particularly in the Arab world, have every single right to be angry, and not just demanding justice, demanding revenge. They have
Mhm.
every right. But again, paradoxically, sometimes indulging in that, as righteous and as understandable as it is, becomes a spoiler to actually solving the public problem.
Mhm.
Most of what we do is predicated upon doing exactly what um, doesn't feel right, but um, uh, intellectually seems right,
Mhm.
and sometimes going against your gut instinct opens up doors that, I certainly never knew were there until I took the first
Mhm.
step,
Mhm.
with a lot of resistance against me from the community, because no one likes to be put in a situation that makes them uncomfortable. And that's
So
precisely
true.
what we.
So true. And I have a few more questions of my own, but our conversation just went this direction. And I'm seeing there's a question from the audience that fits this flow perfectly. So there's a question asking, how can we, as queer change makers, change our mindset to become more impactful in our efforts? So I think it ties nicely to the community, kind of getting pushback from your own community situation. So what would you advise such a person?
Well, this sort of, really, honestly, this work, if you really distill it down to it, it's about disappointing virtually everybody at a rate that they can tolerate. Because
Mhm.
what you're dealing with is, when you talk about systemic long-term problem, obviously there are no technical solutions, or they would have been found out a long time ago. What requires to shift it is a shift in values, and particularly core values that your body and your mind actively protect and resist. When someone attacks your core values, your body and your mind reacts as if they're attacking you physically. And it's going to take a completely radical approach in order for you to shift this mindset. So one of the things that has been incredibly difficult for us was to not only, sort of uh, engaging with the adversary, quote unquote, is easy compared to when you go back to your own faction and try to convince them that what you just did wasn't a betrayal,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that, you don't expect everybody to be able to do this, because some people have been through trauma, some people have been through adversity that doesn't allow them the bandwidth to do this. But
Mhm.
we, as Ashoka fellows, or as people that are interested in solving public problems, it's not just advisable, it is a responsibility for us to make that step and bear the consequences.
Mhm.
There's no fame or happiness to this work. There's no such thing as inspiring people to change. My experience has been that this has been one indignity after another,
Mhm.
and you're trying to hold people's pain and loss across the board in order to hopefully convince everybody to shift the system to a place which is more equitable for everybody. So,
Mhm.
to answer that question specifically and to use the labor rights framework, our question now isn't is to say, um, how can labor rights be extended to encompass queer people? Our question is now, how can queer people fight for labor rights, period? That's what empowerment means. It means you're not waiting for anybody to, but you've taken that first step. You've entered that space. When we talk to other labor rights activists that are from the most rural conservative areas of Lebanon, my question is, hello, I'm a queer activist interested in fighting for the labor rights of everyone. Do I have a place here or not? That is a much more sort of a much more difficult question for people to ignore than, hi, what can you do for me because I'm a oppressed minority, even though I am.
What I'm hearing is actually so it's a lot about identity, but not just about identity. So you are kind of also talking about sharing values and strategies. With unlikely people, for example, if the employment challenge is also with the rural communities, then you can find some, but you're not abandoning your identity in any way.
No.
Almost sounds like a delicate dance, actually.
It's a knife's edge.
Yeah,
it's walking on a knife's edge. But as queer people, identity is incredibly important for us, particularly trans individuals when it comes to gender identity and expression. We can never let that go. But once it becomes the only unifying factor, you're actually excluding not just other people, but opportunities, strategies, sort of initiatives that you can do from your thinking space. It can't just be about identity. It has to be about values. It has to be about strategy. It has to be about seeing other people as well. Because let me tell you, most of the adversaries, most of the oppressors aren't, this sort of head of the pyramid, a very clear-cut villain. There are other oppressed minorities that may have it worse off than you do, including economically, socially, culturally, legally, historically.
And we know kind of the oppressed becoming the oppressor, so they can have that kind of dynamic as well.
Which is what we see on a daily basis.
Definitely. There are actually really good questions. There is one question specific to your local context. So I'm just gonna favor that as the moderator. So they're asking, how specific is Lebanon compared to other countries in the region? Is it the right environment, the laboratory to launch other projects in the region?
That is a really difficult question to ask, because so much of what is known about Lebanon, particularly from a freedoms and a particularly LGBT rights framework, is both grossly exaggerated, but also sort of unappreciated at the same time. My answer to this is always, things aren't as good as you hope, but not as bad as you fear. And in Lebanon, the way that we work is that we are constantly reacting to the sort of socioculture and geopolitical reality that we're in. What is possible in Lebanon right now using this framework is obviously not possible in other parts of the region, in which activists are still concerned with safety, with anonymity, with access to resources. But the framework nevertheless still stands, because it depends on exactly who it is that you're engaging with and who you need to build power with. Lebanon, I would have said before the blast, definitely would be a place where we were going to win, because that October 17 revolution and the unprecedented women and queer representation in it that dominated headlines was, to me, honestly, that revolution was the first ever Pride parade in the Arab world.
It was beautiful, by the way, kind of seeing the women's movement and the LGBTQ movement.
It was front and center. And what was so unique, Zainab, was that no one was holding up a rainbow flag. No one was holding up a flag that said, remove Article 534 of the Penal Code that criminalizes same-sex, or is used to criminalize same-sex relations. People were asking for an end of corruption, to jobs, to social security, and unabashedly, undeniably queer in the way they asked for it and the way they...
It was actually in the language and in the atmosphere of the movement, I think, which was quite impressive. I'm gonna actually favor one more question. It's very practical, but I think it's very important. We have a participant from Qatar, and they are saying there is no support center for the LGBTQ community here. So do you as Helam work and support people in other Arab countries?
Yes, we do. And particularly, there's a huge amount of interest in working with the GCC. There are lots of activists working across the GCC, but in their own way, and trying to figure out what does the LGBT rights movement look like in a country like Saudi Arabia, or in a country like the UAE or
Mhm.
Qatar, which are very unique in the way their government works and the way their culture is, and the role of migrant workers there, and who exactly is being oppressed from the queer community, etc., etc. So there's that we do a lot of work there,
Can
and
you tell us what GCC stands for, just in case our audience is wondering?
yeah, it's the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Okay.
So all of the Saudi Arabia,
Gulf
Qatar,
countries.
Kuwait, Bahrain,
Mhm.
and all of the countries of the peninsula itself in the Arab world.
Mhm.
Um, and the strategic advantage that Helm has is that we actually have 20 years of experience of what does it look like to build a movement from scratch in the cultural and social, economic, historical context of the Arab world. Not
Mhm.
something that we've imported from elsewhere and tried to forcibly fit. We've
Mhm.
experimented with what works and what doesn't, and what comes first and what doesn't for 20 years. And that's why I'm so happy that you called the talk from um, uh, rights to jobs, because are the two mutually exclusive? or
Mhm.
or uh, more importantly, does one lead to the other, and if so, in which direction? These are
Mhm.
the kinds of questions that we've spent 20 years trying to answer, where other parts of the world sort of figured it out for them,
Mhm.
and we then realized, well, that's not necessarily how we work here, is it? And
Mhm.
situating the movement within the greater geopolitical and sociocultural context has been the key in understanding what works and what doesn't, and what
That's
strategy.
where the magic happens, right? Like
Yeah,
when
yeah, yeah, yeah.
importing. So we're right on time, actually. My last question to you is what excites you kind of when you turn off Zoom in a few minutes? It's probably another Zoom meeting, but what excites you these days?
It's very difficult to be excited in Lebanon right now because, the explosion kind of destroyed the horizon for many people. And, I realized, like, I'm 38, and people, whenever they used to say the next generation, I'm like, hey, they're talking about me. And then I
Mhm.
realized they're not talking about me anymore, are they?
I
And maybe
hear
it's
you.
not, it's not my generation that's going to plant the seed. Maybe it's my generation that's gonna have to continue tilling the earth.
Mhm.
And one of the things about hitting rock bottom in a place like Lebanon is that finally we've opened up the conversation not just to technical fixes. We're now talking about who are we as a people? What's the public narrative of this place? What kind of people, what kind of culture and society are we trying to build? And what's exciting is that LGBT people in this country specifically are mobilized, visible, active enough to be co-authors of this new public narrative.
Mhm.
We're not going to be left outside. We
Mhm.
have graduated from being whispered about in corners to actually an active discussion, an active file in the political and social salons of Lebanon across the board, institutionally and otherwise.
Mhm.
So, for the first time, even in the midst of all of this despair and all of this pain that we're facing, we've never been busier. We've
Mhm.
never been more engaged and integrated into conversations across the board with policy, private sector, nonprofit organizations, international organizations, the government itself. We've never been more present and more sort of integrated into what's going on. And that is something to be excited about, despite everything.
Definitely is. And I love kind of in your community center when the food crisis hit after the blast, how instead of handing out food boxes, you built a community kitchen and now everyone is around the table, it sounds like, which is really, really inspiring as a metaphor to me. Tarek,
Well,
thank you.
soon enough, when the lockdown ends, we're gonna resume that. But
Yeah,
yeah, that's the
right now,
idea. Yeah, that's the
definitely. That's
idea.
the idea, kind of the empowered community that's gonna take on the challenges of the future. So Tarek, thank you. Always so inspiring to talk with you.
Thank you.
And basically, I'm telling our audience to look out for an email if you were registered to this event. So you will get additional resources about Tarek's work and Welcome Change series in general. And we hope you'll join us next time. Welcome Change happens every Wednesday on different time slots. So some of them fit the Americas more, some of them fit Europe and Middle East more. So be on the watch out for the next ones. I believe the one coming up is on young people and mental health. And we're going to have an unconventional Mother's Day edition talking about parenthood and motherhood in the 21st century in early May. So you can sign up for those from the link in the chat. And stay safe, and we'll see you soon.